Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics. This week's questions answered video. What are my thoughts on the close action retention system? Commonly referred to as CAR, it is a pistol method. If you're not familiar with it, it was developed by a former law enforcement officer named Paul Castle. This is a very, I guess, interesting topic because it's a pistol technique you don't see much outside of the West, mainly California, mainly Southern California geographically seems to be the epicenter of the Los Angeles area. I don't know of any instructor that I personally know who actually teaches this system, and I've only met a few instructors throughout my career who actually taught and recommended this system. The idea behind it wasn't a marksmanship system so much as it was a gunfighting system, specifically emphasis on gunfighting. If you do some research into CAR, you'll find that that's kind of the push behind it. It's not intended for general purposes or general applications, it's for gunfighting, that very wide non-specific category of presupposition, I guess. So my general feelings on CAR are pretty simple. It is advantageous at distances in which any system is advantageous. Obviously not getting into the specific minutia about what CAR is and what CAR isn't and what CAR can do and what CAR can't do. There's a great deal of research you can do on your own. A little bit of Googling is going to give you, it's going to show you exactly what we're talking about. This is one of those positions you see in movies a lot. In fact, the first John Wick film used some very CAR-inspired techniques, and that makes it seem sexy and dynamic and effective. However, we are talking about a movie. And while the actor in question in that movie, Keanu Reeves, is very proficient in firearms, as the internet is going to continually to remind you every time they show that video of him training at Taron's range for John Wick 2, it's still just a movie. They get to do the take over and over and over and over and over again until they get it specifically right. And sometimes we forget that. Outside of that, outside of its sexiness and its appeal to some people and some stunt coordinators in the movie industry, I don't really see any real advantage to the system at all, especially when you consider that outside of very close distances, the system completely falls apart and you have to revert to a more traditional but less sexy way to shoot the gun. Here's the thing, I don't give a shit what your technique looks like as long as it's correct and it's effective at all distances you could realistically be expected to shoot at. Any kind of technique that's only going to be ergonomic or useful inside of a very enclosed space, and even then it's arguable that any technique would work, to me doesn't really appeal and doesn't appeal to me. And it's not something that I'm going to dedicate a great amount of time to because its usefulness only exists in that small little category. Of course, the argument can be made, well, only use it there, and that's perfectly reasonable because there's some techniques that you would use at certain distances and you wouldn't use at other distances, specifically talking about marksmanship techniques on the handgun. However, things should be able to translate. And if they're specifically built for one certain aspect of shooting that, again, presupposes that this is where the action is going to take place, they have to be versatile enough to apply to all things. And when I go back to any technique is going to be advantageous to those distances, any correct technique and use of the handgun, you're going to problem solve in the real world. So it doesn't really, I guess, lend itself well to being fluid. It's a rigid technique that applies to a very short distance. Of course, further evidence to this is the fact that it goes back to me mentioning my peers, other firearms instructors. We don't teach it because we don't need to teach it. It's not that we have some kind of bias against Paul Castle's system so much as Paul Castle's system didn't apply to what we were teaching to begin with. The system for close quarter shooting has been in place, and granted there's small differences here and there, but the basic fundamentals are close retention of the firearm, accuracy based on kinesthetics or point shooting. That stuff's existed since, well, Fairburn in the 1920s when he wrote Shooting to Live. So it's not a new concept, and the CAR system didn't significantly improve upon or really introduce anything new that wasn't already addressed in a book that came out in the 1920s. Does that mean that it can't be improved upon? Absolutely not. I would argue that it certainly has been improved upon by people who have focused on the commonalities that have happened in close quarter shooting. You look at South NARC's ECQC system, or managing unknown contacts. There's classes such as that. SAGE, we teach weapon retention dynamics, and we address these things as well. There's other programs out there that take what already works and introduce it into the concepts of close retention shooting, or close action shooting, or point shooting, or hip shooting, or whatever you want to call it. The reality of the situation is the CAR was intended for law enforcement, because law enforcement shootings can be at very close distances. Any shooting can be at a close distance. But if you look at the technical aspects, or I should say the technical history of the shootings who have happened, and even though those on our roadmap for what may happen in the future, they do tell us they do give us some commonalities from incident to incident to incident, especially in law enforcement. These textbook retention methods, to the best of my knowledge, any research I've done, they've never actually been used as they are demonstrated, as they are instructed. So the system and the techniques that you teach someone have to be as fluid as possible, because if my rigidity is based on this technique, I have to wait for those conditions to occur to use that technique. Whereas I would rather have a wheel of decisions to be made based on fluid and flexible training that allow me to react to a threat in a way that I guess is more intuitive. Again, this is just my opinion. You don't have to take it as me just wholeheartedly dumping on a system that you use if you choose to use it. Inside of bright line distance, 3 yards, 5 yards, even 7 yards, I'm sure CAR can be accurate and effective. But consider that 2 degrees at the compass is nothing. 2 degrees of deviation at 100 meters from the compass is pretty extreme. So those inaccuracies that are built into CAR as the distance increases are going to become very self-evident. And while you can switch from CAR to traditional marksmanship shooting as distance increases, you could use traditional techniques and bring them all the way back to zero, instead of having that complete fundamental shift from one system to another based on the distance. That's kind of my feelings on it. Again, just my opinion, but my opinion is based on my experience with other instructors. And if you look at organizations that are expected to or have a high likelihood of shooting at close distances for a living, such as federal air marshals, people who work in executive protection, you look at Department of State's training, Secret Services training for their protection details, CAR's not used. And these are people who actively research, constantly trying to find the best practices and the best ways to train people to react to threats in close quarters, and CAR has never been adopted by them. So to me, that's very telling. And I know personally people who've worked in those fields in law enforcement who've gone through a CAR class, or someone who taught a CAR-based program and came back saying, no, we're good with what we've got, we're going to make some tweaks, but we didn't really get any good lessons learned from that. The system's not applicable to what we're doing, so we're just going to go ahead and pass. So that's definitely telling it all. Sometimes asking the question, why aren't people using it, or just looking at the fact that people aren't using it in general, can give you a really good answer of its adaptability or its feasibility for personal defense. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.